But if you could turn in your Bibles with me this morning as we continue our series on the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5, verses 33 to 37. As you guys probably noticed at this point, Pastor Brandon and Eileen are gone this weekend for a wedding. Pastor Brandon was asked to perform the wedding ceremony for some of his former teenagers, and so he is out in Pennsylvania, and so I'm glad to be able to be here and to lead the service this morning. And I am also very thankful. I was mentioning to Garth this morning, originally, when the preaching schedule was made, Pastor Brandon sent to me the schedule, and I was like, oh man. When you don't preach every week, it's different, right? When you preach every week, but when you don't preach every week, you don't want to have like the downer passages. And he sent the schedule out to me, and originally it was on divorce, and I was like, really? I preach once a month, and I get the downer one. But then I was also very thankful. I didn't say anything to him, but the Lord moved in his heart, and he sent me a follow-up text and said, you know what, I'm going to preach about divorce before I leave, and then you can take the next passage. And so I'm thankful to be preaching not on that topic, but on the next one down the line, which is the issue of taking oaths. When I was in high school, I had a friend named Chris, and Chris had a wild imagination. And Chris loved to tell stories, and his stories were often extravagant, and because they were extravagant, they were unbelievable, and they were unbelievable for a reason, because they never happened. But the reason he told these stories is because he wanted to captivate the minds of his classmates and to really just bask in the attention that he got when he told these stories. One day, Chris had this not-so-brilliant idea that he would tell a story that he had received a gift that would make all of us jealous. So he comes into school one day and he claimed that over the weekend he had been presented from a rich uncle whom we had, of course, never met, that this rich uncle had gifted him with a vintage Ford Mustang. It was sleek, it was powerful, it sounded awesome. It would turn the heads on any road. In fact, he shared with us how he was getting attention from all the ladies as he drove down the road. That's what he assured me of anyways. And the very thought of such a magnificent car sent a wave of excitement throughout the school because, of course, if it was true, we all assumed, Chris, you're going to let us drive it, right? Well, eager to see this vehicle with our own eyes, we begged Chris to show it to us. But with each request, Chris would come up with an excuse. Well, not this week because, I was driving it and man, it is so fast. But I was driving it so fast that, I hit a pothole and it has to go into the shop for repairs. Okay. Chris, is your car repaired? Yeah, it's repaired. Well, can you bring it into school? We want to see it. Well, the thing is that my cousin's getting married and they wanted a real cool car to drive away in, and so we lent it out to them. All right, got it. Excuse after excuse about why we could not see this magnificent car. And eager to see this legendary vehicle with our own eyes, we continued to beg Chris. He continued to give us excuses, and as time went on, Chris's stories about the Mustang became increasingly elaborate. He painted vivid pictures of thrilling drives and his high speeds and his escape from the police and all these kinds of wild things. Over time, of course, Chris's friends, including myself, no longer believed Chris. We noticed the inconsistencies in Chris's stories, and soon Chris's friends even questioned whether or not this Mustang existed. Was this a real Mustang, or was it just a figment of Chris's fantasies? And Chris's once captivated audience now harbored skepticism whenever Chris would tell a story. However, Chris remained persistent in his claims, continued to tell not only that story, but stories about other things. And in each successive story, Chris was always the hero, always the beneficiary of some unbelievable thing. And in time, Chris's friends began to distance themselves from him, realizing that Chris had literally lost touch with reality and lost touch with what made Chris's friends his friends in the first place. And instead of gaining the attention that he sought, Chris ended up losing his friends who could no longer take what he said as being true. And as much as I would love to say that that's a false story, that is a real story. And Chris failed to grasp the value of his own credibility. Unfortunately, Chris's story is not that uncommon, is it? Now, we might not go about telling people elaborate stories about exotic cars that we have, because we know that people would catch us in those things. But we all know that person who has exaggerated about their past accomplishments so they could get the position that they currently have. Or that acquaintance who continually makes promises that they can't keep. Or the gossip who consistently spreads rumors whether or not they're true. Or the confidant who always seems to share sensitive information. One preacher went as far as to say, the entire system of the world in which we live is built on lying. After all, it's all spawned from Satan, of whom, said Jesus in John chapter 8 and verse 44, he is the father of lies, and all men are born liars. In fact, the whole of our society is a network of fabrication. We shade the truth, we cheat, we exaggerate, we tax dodge, we fail to keep our promises, we flatter for gain, we betray confidence, we make excuses, we tell half-truths, we tell white lies, and etc. Now that's a pretty bleak outlook on people's integrity and people's honesty. That is not great news. And as we approach this topic in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, aren't you glad that one of Jesus' agendas in his Sermon on the Mount is to debunk the traditions of men? This is what you do, but this is what you should do. And Jesus lays very clearly out for us what it means to be a kingdom citizen and how that impacts our credibility. And Jesus lays out for us the call to credibility. And aren't you glad that in Christ we belong to a kingdom which is not built on lies, but which is built on truth? And we are called to credibility. And through the power of God working in our lives, we don't have to participate in the common practices and the traditions of men in deception. You know, looking back historically at Jesus' audience, the Jews of the day, they did understand the value of truth in principle, but they did not participate in it in practice. And Jesus points out that they had buried the truth so far underneath their own traditions that instead of honoring God, they had manufactured a tradition that only served and benefited themselves. So as we return our attention back to the Sermon on the Mount, we're going to focus specifically on verses 33 to 37, where Jesus continues to challenge the traditions of men by pointing out God's standards for both truthfulness and authenticity. And so let's turn our attention to Matthew chapter 5, verses 33. Jesus says, "Again, you have heard that it was said to those of old, 'You shall not swear falsely, but shall perform your oaths to the Lord.' But I say to you, do not swear at all, neither by heaven, for it is God's throne, nor by the earth, for it is his footstool, nor by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King. Nor shall you swear by your head, because you cannot make one hair white or black. But let your yes be yes, and your no, no. For whatever is more than these is from the evil one." And so first, Jesus lays out for us what God's standard is for truthfulness. And first, Jesus says, just like he has been saying, "Again, you have heard that it was said to those of old, 'You shall not swear falsely, but shall perform your oaths to the Lord.'" And again, he's appealing to not necessarily the Old Testament law, but to the modern Jewish tradition's interpretation of the Old Testament law. And Jesus goes on to say that you shall not swear at all, which begs our first question. Is Jesus forbidding any kind of oaths in any kind of circumstance whatsoever? That's an important question for us to ask because it has important ramifications for us. Because all of us in this room have performed an oath. So is Jesus saying that we're in the wrong if we've ever performed an oath? Not only have we performed oaths, but as we look back to the Old Testament, we see that there were some very faithful saints that performed oaths. So the first and fundamental question we must ask is, were oaths forbidden in the Old Testament? And if they were not, what is it that Jesus is attacking about the oaths of the modern Jewish tradition? Well, if we're to look back into the Old Testament, the traditional teaching that Jesus is refuting here is a mixture and a combination of three different passages in the Old Testament. First, it's a combination of Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 12, which says, "And you shall not swear by my name falsely, nor shall you profane the name of your God. I am the Lord." And the meaning of Leviticus 19 and verse 12 is pretty straightforward. When you read it, it's pretty on its face value. It is what it is. And it is this: you shall not swear by my name falsely. In other words, if you're going to take an oath, you've got to keep it. That's the principle. You shall not swear by my name falsely, because if you do, you profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. So Leviticus chapter 19 is not saying that you can never perform an oath, but he is saying, God is saying through Moses, that when you do perform an oath, you have to keep it. Because to not keep an oath is to profane the name of the Lord. It's also a combination of Numbers 30 and verse 2, which says, "If a man makes a vow to the Lord or swears an oath to bind himself by some argument, he shall not break his word. He shall do according to all that proceeds out of his mouth." And again, the meaning is pretty straightforward. If you make a promise, not only in the name of the Lord, but if you make a promise to the Lord, you had better keep it. Because you're promising it to the Lord, you're calling God as your witness, and you're making this promise to the Lord, and if you do so, you're obligated to keep it. And then lastly, they draw from Deuteronomy chapter 23 and verse 21. "When you make a vow to the Lord your God, you shall not delay to pay it. The Lord your God will surely require it of you, and it would be sin to you." And again, very straightforward. If you make a promise to the Lord your God, not only should you keep it, but you should keep it as fast as possible, because it's your obligation to follow through on the oaths that you make to the Lord and in the Lord's name. So in the Old Testament, God did provide for the taking of oaths. In these passages, neither of these passages, which the Jewish tradition was drawing from, none of these passages forbid oaths in general. Because God did provide for the taking of oaths by his name as an accommodation to sinful human behavior. In other words, the oaths that we see being made in the Old Testament are oaths that are made on solemn occasions in God's name, because those saints intend to follow through on the things that they promise. These are the circumstances under which Old Testament oaths were given. Proper oath-taking calls God as a witness to the event that is about to take place and holds the oath-taker liable before judgment, before God, so that God would execute judgment if that oath was broken. That's the Old Testament standard for oath-taking. Now, that's a pretty high standard. When you take an oath, it's a serious event. taken before God in the name of God, and you must follow through. And if you don't, you are literally, by taking that oath, binding yourself to judgment if you do not follow through. Those are pretty serious circumstances. And we see these circumstances throughout the Old Testament. We see Abraham in Genesis chapter 14 taking an oath. But Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have raised my hand to the Lord. What is he doing? He is making an oath to God and calling God as witness and making this promise to the king of Sodom, God Most High, the professor of heaven and earth, that I will take nothing from a thread to a sandal strap, that I will not take anything that is yours, lest you shall say, I've made Abraham rich, except only what the young men have eaten in the portion of the men who went with me, Aner, Eshol, and Mamre, let them take their portion. And so Abram performs an oath. We see David and Jonathan perform an oath together. It says in 1 Samuel chapter 20 and verse 16, so Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, let the Lord require it at the hand of David's enemies. What is Jonathan doing? He is making a covenant. He is making an oath, calling God as witness so that this oath would be followed through on. And not only do we see Old Testament saints taking oaths, we see God himself taking oaths. As we turn our attention to Genesis chapter 22, verses 16 and 17, and God said, by myself I have sworn, says the Lord. Because you have done this thing, and in this context, God had asked Abraham to offer up Isaac as a sacrifice. And when Abraham showed that he was willing to offer up Isaac as a sacrifice, the Lord stops him and makes this promise. He says, by myself I have sworn, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son. Blessing I will bless you, and multiplying I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven and as the sand which are on the seashore, and your descendants shall possess the gate of their enemies. Now, in all of these circumstances, these oaths were taken in the name of God, calling God as witness with the intent to follow through. Not only the intent, but in all these circumstances, there actually was follow through. This is the methodology for proper oath-taking. And the purpose of taking oaths was to add seriousness to an event, to add emphasis to the importance of something that was going on. For example, in Genesis chapter 22, when God makes an oath by his own name, is it because God usually tells lies to Abraham, but on this occasion, he's telling Abraham the truth? Is that the case with God taking an oath? No, that's obviously not the case. The Bible's very clear that God stands for and only participates in the truth. So what's the purpose of God taking an oath? It is to add seriousness and urgency to his communication to Abraham that indeed this is his will and it will happen. So these are the circumstances, the intent of Old Testament oath-taking. Like I mentioned earlier, if oaths were completely illegitimate, we'd all be in trouble. For example, we have participated in Old Testament style oath-taking. For example, Pastor Brandon right now is performing a wedding ceremony. What happens at a wedding ceremony? Well, you have a bride and a groom that stand together before witnesses and they take an oath. They add seriousness to a serious event and they call God as witness that they fully intend to follow through on the promises that they make on that day. We see courtroom oaths where someone who is about to give witness places their left hand on a Bible, raises their right hand and says, I promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God. Adding seriousness to a serious event, calling God as witness, and in our legal system, there is a judgment for perjuring yourself. If you are to lie after taking an oath that you would not, you will experience jail time. That is an Old Testament style oath. or swearing in ceremonies where a government official swears by God's name to fulfill the promises that they make about the duties that they are to participate in that office. We take oaths whenever we participate in a pledge or a creed or an affirmation. We pledge allegiance, right, to the American flag, who's a nation what? Under God. These are Old Testament style oaths. And so oaths are not totally forbidden. So why is it that Jesus is saying, listen, you shouldn't be doing this at all? Well, as usual, with the things that Jesus is bringing up in the Sermon on the Mount, whenever he says, you have heard it said, he's directly referring to the traditions of men. They had taken what was meant to be a serious occasion, a binding occasion made in the name of God to ensure a follow-through. They had taken something like that, and they had made accommodations to it in order to serve themselves. What was it about the traditions of men, the traditions of oath-taking in Jesus' day, that caused Jesus to say, listen, you should not be doing this at all? Well, there's two key things. Number one, Jesus was refuting oaths taken with no regard to a serious context. In other words, Jesus was saying, first of all, you guys are cheapening the use of oaths because you are taking oaths on a daily basis. You know, one of the examples that came immediately to my mind after years of dealing with teenagers is that I have organized and participated in an innumerable amount of dodgeball games, dodgeball tournaments. You name it, dodgeball, we've done it, right? There was a period of time where we were playing dodgeball at least once a week. And I was like, guys, we cannot be playing dodgeball every week. But that's a whole different story. But often what you'll see in dodgeball is you'll see one person, especially with kids and teens, you'll see one person approach another person and say, listen, I promise you, I make an alliance with you. If you do not throw your ball at me, I will not throw my ball at you. Which is a crazy covenant to make, because inevitably, even if you do follow through on that promise, there's going to be the two of you left, right? Somebody's got to break it. And then, of course, you know, the one kid gets the other kid out, and the one kid says, listen, you made a promise, you made a covenant with me. And the one says, yeah, I did, but you didn't see that my fingers were crossed behind my back. You ever seen that happen? That's what Jesus is saying. You shouldn't be doing that at all. The people in Jesus' day were making oaths in regards to their everyday conversations, and the oaths had become meaningless. What is it that they were teaching? They were teaching, it says in verse 33, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform your oaths to the Lord. That sounds biblical, doesn't it? You make an oath to the Lord, you keep it. I mean, that sounds right, but here's the problem. Here's what they were promoting in practice. If you don't make an oath and invoke God's name, you don't have to keep it. Oaths were designed and designated as marks of integrity for life's serious moments, but instead, oaths were so common in this time that no one took them seriously anymore. And instead of being marks of integrity, there were warnings of insincerity. Second thing that Jesus was refuting about the tradition of oaths was that they were limiting the oaths to oaths that were taken before the Lord. So in other words, I could take an oath, and I could say, I promise on my own life. Well, because I've promised on my own life, I haven't taken that oath before the Lord. I've taken that oath before me, right? I'm free to break oaths that I take before myself, calling myself as witness to bear judgment on myself, right? Of course, I'm going to let myself go for my own judgment, right? I swear on my own life that I will X. This is what Jesus is refuting. And notice the crafty nature of their tradition. It seemed biblical, but they had designated a failsafe for themselves. Oaths to the Lord were to be kept, while oaths invoked on anything else, you're free. You're free to break those. And so as a result, Jesus points out, you've made a habit of swearing by heaven. Not God, just heaven. You've made a habit of swearing by earth. You've made a habit of swearing by Jerusalem. You even made a habit of swearing on your own head or your own life. But Jesus points out that it doesn't really matter how you attempt to escape the law of God. The law of God is still there. Jesus points out that their attempts to skirt the Old Testament law are useless. Why? He says, listen, you're trying to get around the law in all these creative ways. However, I want you to notice that heaven is God's throne. Earth is his footstool. Jerusalem is his city. And to swear by your own head is meaningless because you have no control over your own life. You have no ability to influence the future. In other words, Jesus is saying, whenever you take an oath, whether you invoke God as witness or not, you are taking that oath before God. Because God does not look at creation as separate things. God looks at creation as all things that he has made. And to swear by heaven is to invoke God as witness. To swear by earth, with which God has made, is to invoke God as witness. To swear even by his city or your own life is to invoke God as witness. Because who is it that created and has control over all those things? Is it you? No. God is always the ultimate authority. In other words, Jesus points out, all oaths are made before God. And when you make an oath, whether it's by heaven, whether it's by earth, whether it's by Jerusalem, whether it's by the temple, whether it's by your own head, whether it's by the gold in the temple, it doesn't matter. There is no exceptions for breaking your oath. Therefore, Jesus concludes, to carelessly call any part of God's creation as a witness to a false oath is to dishonor God himself. God is a God of truth, and to disregard truth is to disregard God. Jesus says, you have heard it said that you shall not break your oaths made to the Lord. No. But I say to you, you shouldn't be making these kinds of oaths at all. If you intend to break it, you shouldn't be making it. We might say, you know what? This week I've skated pretty free. I don't go around making oaths, which I really don't, because it seems odd, right? To go around making promises. Janie, I swear on my own life I'll clean the dishes. Right? That seems like a weird thing to do. But this is also in regards to our conduct, right? How we behave. How we behave, for example, in church versus how we behave at work. You know, how many of you guys have ever heard it said, and I know I have, and this is a kind of modernizing of Pharisaical teaching. You ever heard somebody say something they shouldn't say in a church building? And somebody goes, oh, you shouldn't say that. You're in the church. You're in God's house. Which my immediate thought is, well, does that mean that if we step out into the parking lot, now I can say it? There's an inconsistency in behavior. This also is in regards to our conduct. We cannot act one way in one circumstance and act a different way in a different circumstance because God expects us to be authentic in all of our circumstances. God's standard for truthfulness is both truthfulness as well as consistent behavior and conduct, and it is absolute sincerity and dependability, even in life's most routine conversations. And this is why it's so important, right? Because most of our life is routine conversations. Imagine a person like Chris who goes around in his everyday conversations, and you are continually saying things that are not true, acting in ways that are inconsistent. Then when it comes time for those serious moments like a wedding or a courtroom or being sworn into an office, when it comes time for those moments, what credibility does your oath have? They were making oaths in order to add credibility to incredible people. But Jesus says, the opposite is what's actually happening. The more you take oaths, and the more often you break them, the less credible you become. And even in life's most serious circumstances, you cannot be taken seriously. God's standard is absolute truthfulness, absolute sincerity, absolute dependability, absolute consistency. Now that's a tough standard. And he goes on to say that this standard extends to your authenticity, that you ought to be both truthful and authentic. And he finishes in verse 37, says, but you ought to let your yes be yes and your no, no, for whatever is more than these is from the evil one. I worked with a guy for months, very recently actually. He's probably in his early 20s. He was always trying to get out of work. He was always trying to tell me that disasters were happening at home, that people were sick, that he was sick, that this, that, and the other thing was going on. And one day, actually, something serious did happen, and he said, listen, this is what's going on. And I said, listen. And his name was Noah, not this Noah. I said, listen, Noah, I can't believe you anymore. Whenever you say that something is true, I always doubt it. So the answer is no. You cannot leave work without getting written up because I don't believe you. When you say something, Jesus says, it ought to mean something. God's standard for authenticity is simple. When you say it, you mean it. And because you have a consistent pattern of saying something and following through, people actually believe you. Wow. Every simple word, every normal conversation should be authentic and true. And as has been Jesus' pattern throughout this sermon, this is God's kingdom principles for kingdom citizens. A kingdom citizen's speech does not need any qualifications. When somebody says something to me or I say something to somebody else, I shouldn't have to say, well, I swear on the chapel church, right? I shouldn't have to do that. I shouldn't have to go out of my way to say, I really mean it this time, because I have a consistent pattern of following through on things that I say. No qualification, no decoration. A kingdom citizen's life is a life of absolute integrity. Chris's story serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of our own credibility. Our embellishments, our fabrications, our empty promises only matter as much as our own credibility and our ability to follow through on the things that we say we will do. Just a few weeks ago, I was tempted to be inauthentic in the fact that I had promised two people actually, that because of their hard work, I would buy them pints of ice cream. And one day, I left work and I thought to myself, you know what? I might never see these two people again. What's the ramifications if I don't get those pints of ice cream? But actually, I knew that we were in the Sermon on the Mount, and God brought this passage to my mind, and I thought, I had better buy those 2 pints of ice cream, because God holds me to that standard of authenticity. So I left work that day, came all the way back and dropped off ice cream because I knew that's what God expects. When we're inauthentic, while we may initially command the trust of others, if we will eventually lose their trust and respect if we waver on our commitment to simple truth-telling. And it's crucial to understand that credibility not only forms the foundation of our human relationships and integrity, but it also underpins our very worship of God. You cannot continually take oaths before God and break them and come to God with authentic, meaningful worship. And so as citizens of God's kingdom, we ought to strive to be people of simple honesty, authenticity, reliability, consistently aligning our words with our actions. And in a world filled with deceit, God gives us the tool of truth and authenticity to point those in our community, to point those that we work with, to point those that we come in contact with, to the hope of the gospel of Jesus Christ.